let's jump into the fourth panel of the conference and the first panel for day 2. This panel is titled, What Threatens Space Security, Space Systems and the Threat Vectors. And I'm very pleased to have with us here today an excellent lineup of panelists, moderator by an also very excellent moderator, Victoria Sampson from Secure World Foundation. I will allow her to introduce every one of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. As Aidan said, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with my organization, the Secure World Foundation is a small nonprofit based in the United States that focuses on space sustainability. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for everyone. And we're delighted to be co-organizers of this conference. We have a long-standing history with UNIDIR, and we're delighted to be able to continue this conversation. So panel 4, talking about what threatens space security, space systems, and threat vectors. As you know, space security and stability are endangered by a wide array of threats, and these can take the form of various types: space to space, space to ground to space, even ground to ground threats. So this panel will talk about those threats and the forms that they can take in order to attempt to determine how best to mitigate and prevent these threats. So the security and stability of space has been a concern since the beginning of the space age. It is more acute now, however, because more than 80 countries have satellites in orbit, and there is a rising dependence on space capabilities for such critical needs as economic development, environmental monitoring, and disaster management. Although space security has historically been perceived as relevant only to the geopolitical superpowers, nearly every person on this planet uses space data in some way, shape, or form, and thus benefits from a predictable, stable space environment with reliable access to that information. Today, a number of countries are developing counter-space capabilities, which are capable of deceiving, disrupting, denying, degrading, or even destroying objects in space. The incentive to develop and potentially use these weapons stems from the growing role that space capabilities play today in nearly every modern military force, particularly those of the major nuclear superpowers. Disrupting an opponent's space capabilities might be considered in a military setting. It could also lead to escalation, nuclear or otherwise, and create long-term risk long after the war ends. It is at this point that I'm contractually obligated to suggest that you all, after this panel is over, please visit Secure World Foundation's website for a document which is freely available to all entitled Global Counterspace Capabilities, an Open Source Assessment. In this document, we look at 11 countries' counterspace capabilities in terms of direct ascent, co-orbital, directed energy, radio frequency interference, and cyber. We have the executive summary translated in all 6 official UN languages. So it's a 200-page document. I'm not going to go too deep into this right now, but I will point, because I want to make sure we get to hear from our excellent panel, but I will point out that although many countries are developing counterspace capabilities in terms of significant research and development, and they're looking at a broad range of destructive and non-destructive capabilities, I will emphasize and underline that only non-destructive counterspace capabilities are currently being used in active military operations. So with that, let's move on to our panel to hear their thoughts on this issue. I'll introduce them all and then go into our speaking. First, we have Aidan Liddle, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom Delegation to the Conference of Disarmament here in Geneva. And then we have Raji Rajagopalan, the Director, Center for Security, Strategy and Development at the Observer Research Foundation. And then we have 2 excellent panelists coming in online, where it's very late where they are, so we really appreciate them staying up for this. The first one is Cassandra Steer, Deputy Director, Australian National University Institute for Space. And then finally, Guoyu Wang, Dean, Academy of Air, Space Policy and Law, Beijing Institute of Technology. And so with that, I'd like to open to our panelists' opening remarks, as has been the process so far. We're going to give a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll have some questions from me, and then open up to you, the audience, both here and online. So with that, Aidan, please start.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Victoria. It's a pleasure to be back at the Outer Space Security Conference. It's great to be back in a physical room as well with people, and fantastic that we've got an opportunity for people not in Geneva to join online as well. So thanks very much to the organisers for putting this excellent conference together once again. So I'm going to talk a bit about threats, and I think you can look at the threats that we face in space, or how to characterize the threats that we face in space, in sort of 3 layers. So I'm going to sort of zoom out a little bit first, and then sort of get into the more detailed questions. So I see, as I say, three layers really when you're talking about how to characterize threats. So I think the first thing, the first layer is that threat really is derived from the overall situation. So this is even a step sort of before you get into talking about capabilities and systems. What do I mean by that? I mean that countries' threat perception, or the threat environment that exists, is first and foremost a function of the overall geopolitical situation and of the environment in space, the situation in the space domain. I don't need to say too much about this because I think we all agree that the overall geopolitical situation at the moment is not ideal. We see international relations being characterized by competition. This is not limited to the space domain, of course. It's political, military, economic, technological, even ideological in some senses. But of course, the space domain itself is not immune from or isolated from these overall sort of geopolitical tensions. We also see the threat picture as being influenced by developments in the space domain itself. They are, of course, as I say, dependent to a certain extent or impacted by the overall geopolitical environment. But in space in particular, in the space domain in particular, we see increased congestion, increased competition, as Victoria said, significantly increased range of actors, of objects, of systems, and of the range of uses that those systems can be put to. Yes, by states, by militaries, but also for civilian purposes, by commercial actors, by scientific researchers, and others. Of course, space launch is getting cheaper and more accessible every year. The range of services that's on offer is, of course, greatly expanding. We know, of course, what benefits they have to civilian life, but even from a military point of view, space systems are obviously now primarily used for communications, for command and control, for navigation, for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, imaging, ballistic missile launch warning, and a whole range of other uses. So the fact that you have this sort of range of this increasing range of actors, this increasing range of services operating on in and through space is also sort of increases both the range of threats and the impact of those threats to people's interests, and because, of course, of the uses that these systems can be put to, that obviously is in some senses a driver for developing counter-space capabilities as well, but also, of course, for conversations like this about how to mitigate them. And how to defend against them. So that's my first layer, if you like. You've got to look at the overall geopolitical situation and the characteristics and the developing characteristics of the space domain to understand the threat environment. The second layer then is perhaps the more familiar starting point, which is the capabilities themselves. What capabilities are there out there which can threaten or provide a means to threaten various actors' interests in space, and there are lots of various taxonomies of how you can divide up and analyse these systems. Victoria's already mentioned the Global Counter-Space Capabilities Report that the Secure World Foundation does. That uses, I think you have sort of 6 categories, don't you? Co-orbital capabilities in LEO and GEO. You have direct ascent. You have directed energy and electronic warfare. So that's 5 categories, I think. think. Others use different taxonomies. The CSIS Space Threat Assessment talks about kinetic physical, non-kinetic physical, electronic and cyber. You can talk about the different vectors that can be affected. You can talk about Earth to Earth, space to space, space to Earth, and Earth to space. This was the categorization that we used in the second session of the open-ended working group a few months ago. You could look at the potential targets, whether you're targeting which sector of the space system you're targeting. Is it the object in orbit? Is it the ground station? Is it the data links up and down between them? Is it the end user? Again, these you can sort of use different ways of categorizing and analyzing these. But I think, and you can look at whether they have reversible and irreversible effects as well in different ways. So there's lots of different ways of analyzing these, and I won't go into the details of which systems can fall into which categories, because they're all out there, and I'm sure my other colleagues will be talking in more detail about that in a minute. But the point is that there are a whole range of capabilities, but all of these capabilities, or almost all of them, are dual use or dual purpose, or potentially dual use or dual purpose. They could have effects which could be deliberate but could be accidental or incidental to their main purpose. They could even be unnoticeable or unattributable. So all of these capabilities in some sense are ambiguous. It's very, very difficult to say that any one of these capabilities is definitively a counter space capability and has no other use. So, for example, if we talk about directed energy capabilities, lasers, they have a perfectly benign use in that most space situational awareness techniques use lasers for tracking space objects. That's how you spot what's in orbit and what they're doing. That's obviously a very good thing. All space domain awareness capabilities effectively use this sort of technology. On the other hand, you can use these capabilities for either temporarily dazzling or permanently blinding the sensors on an imaging satellite. Again, that could be a sort of accidental effect, or it could be a deliberate effect. And it could be reversible or irreversible. Similarly, even with DA ASAT capabilities, these are perhaps the most obvious things which have been demonstrated as having weapon-like uses. But most, in fact, if not all, DA ASAT capabilities that have been demonstrated so far are derived from or simply repurposed as ballistic missile defense interceptors. Now, you can argue about whether these are a good or a bad thing, but there is no reason in international law why countries should not be developing ballistic missile defense systems, and many are. So all of these capabilities, what I'm trying to say is that all of these capabilities either have dual use or dual purpose, or can be explained away in other ways. Another example, one last example I like to use is the debris removing harpoon system that the UK is developing. Again, a harpoon on orbit is a weapon. It's not used as a weapon. It's designed to remove debris. But of course, if your threat perception derived from the first layer of issues that I was talking about allows you could allow you to see that capability as a weapon. So that leads me on to the third layer of factors that you need to look at, which is about the behaviour or intent to which these capabilities are, for which these capabilities are used. So this is about how you use the capabilities. It's about what you say about your intent in developing and deploying these capabilities, what their purpose is, and it's about what you actually do observably in the space domain with these capabilities, and crucially, it's about whether these two things match, whether what you say about your intent for these systems and what you actually do with these systems, if those two things match, then that builds credibility. If they don't, then it undermines it. And this, of course, you can see this as a feedback loop to the first layer as well, because if what you say about your capabilities and what you do with those capabilities match, then that can, as I say, it can enhance credibility, it can build trust, and it can work in some way to mitigate some of those geopolitical factors that I mentioned in the first layer. If they don't match, then of course it can do the opposite, and so you have that feedback loop in that way. So to take the harpoon example, the UK, the people who've been developing this debris removing harpoon have been very transparent, I think. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we have been very transparent in saying what it is, what capability it has, what we're going to use it for, and I think we've demonstrated that in the use to which it's been put. So that's an example of how behaviours, I think, can help. So this, my final word is, this is precisely why we have taken the approach that we have in developing the responsible behaviours approach, because the capabilities themselves are agnostic or dual capable or dual use. It's what you do with them and what you say about what you're going to do with them that really matters. And this is something we can do something about. This is something which is observable, which is objective, and which I think certainly can lead us to a much healthier conversation in how to mitigate the threats overall. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ambassador Liddle. That's an interesting setup, the idea of a tripod examination of what exactly is a threat. And I think that'll really guide the conversation later on today. Thank you. So next speaker, Dr. Rajagopalan.
Yeah. Hi, good morning, everyone, and let me thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's good to be back in Geneva. It's been 3 years plus, so it's great to be out here in this room and engage with people in person rather than staring at the computer screens, which has been the case for almost 3 years. So I think a lot has been said. I think Ambassador Liddle has said a lot, and also Victoria in her opening remarks did talk about the heavy dependence that we all have on space, whether it is for economic, social, or security-related requirements that we have seen to and space has also become so crowded, more than 80 players having a satellite kind of operation in a sense. So therefore, these have become space operations, space functions have become so consequential and so real, which also means that any disturbance, any disruption to the activities, satellite operations are also going to have important consequences in terms of impacting on different sectors and also across different geographies. Nevertheless, despite this heavy dependence on space security or security of space is threatened by a number of recent developments. And sometimes these are categorized as space to space, space to ground, ground to space, and so on and so forth, or even ground to ground. But the fact is that I think the key question to ask is, how are we going to be dealing with these kind of things? What are the different ways to address them? Are there different ways of looking at this? Can we look at, for instance, what are the different means to carry out an attack? Is it the means of attack that is going to be important, or is it the target of the attack that is going to be critical, or is it go by the effects of the attack, irrespective of the means of the attack? So what are the different ways we can do this? Which approach can help us to find some immediate and even maybe some technical measures to deal with these kind of threats that we are seeing play out today? These could be short-term fixes, but I think they could get us in the habit of developing a norm to behave responsibly, in a sense. So when I look at the range of counter space technologies, I think the most impactful is, of course, in terms of the demonstrative effect as well as the damage that it creates, is of course the anti-satellite weapons, in a sense. The use of anti-satellite weapons it's obviously going to trigger a significant response because of the demonstrative value or the visual impact of something as critical as the use of a kinetic physical sort of a counter space use, because it is going to create large amount of debris, but also the visual impact. So that will immediately trigger a response from the party who's been attacked, because a non-response is also going to be construed as a sign of weakness, in a sense. And so, and more importantly, a norm is being broken, and I think that's again an important aspect to look at it. Just a couple of additional points on ASATs, because again, I'm stressing ASATs because I think that's something that is gaining greater traction as a possible way of developing deterrence means and so on and so forth by a number of countries. So far, you have 4 countries who have demonstrated the capability, but there are a few other countries that are that are investing money, putting resources into developing interceptor capability. So I think it's important to look at it. So the direct escalation issue is one aspect in terms of the, for instance, is the damage it creates. Generation of long-lasting debris is one issue. But there is also the issue of other satellites being affected, and hence the issue of unintended consequences and also collateral damage. Consequences of collateral damage to space systems, for instance, were those that provide commercial or civil services, for instance, how those satellites are going to be damaged and what are the kind of impact that you might see. That's one set of issues. Because one can try to hit a satellite of country A, for instance, but it is extremely difficult to carry out such a discriminate and precision attack that you're going to attack only the satellite of country A, in a sense. So it will be indiscriminatory in nature. That is how the mechanics work, in a sense. Therefore, the impact is going to be broader, affecting the satellites of other countries as well. So it will impact the satellites of countries B, country C, country D, country X, and so on and so forth, whose satellites are also going to be damaged. And in essence, you are bringing a whole lot of additional other set of countries into the possibilities of a conflict, in a sense. So the the collateral damage aspect of an ASAT test, I think it's going to be serious, and it also draws in a huge number of other countries into the conflict, in a sense. A second set of disruptive counter space technologies are, of course, the electronic and cyber means, which could again result in significant disruptions. But there are also complications in terms of identification of the source of the attack, for instance, and thereafter the questions of response options. What are the response mechanisms that you can put into play? Questions like how can one determine that an electronic or cyber attack has happened, and what would be the criteria for determination that these attacks are taking place? It's much easier when you have a physical destruction of your asset, or if there have been a casualty and so on and so forth. But when you're not able to see in such clear terms, I think it's going to be a lot more challenging to determine that an attack has taken place. And of course, a more difficult challenge is also to find the source of the attack, who has carried out the attack, and so on and so forth. So this is not going to be as easy as, for instance, an ASAT test, which results in kinetic physical impact, in a sense. So it's usually much simpler when it comes to when you have a physical destruction and so on and so forth. But in cases where there have been only temporary disruptions using lasers or cyber or other electronic warfare means, or even in cases where data has been stolen, for instance, or things of that kind, these situations are going to be a lot more problematic and, of course, do not offer easy solutions. So what kind of response can a state or a private sector actor can come up with is still unclear. Given that these threats are already playing out for more than a decade now, we need to seriously think about how we can come up with some norms to restrict some of this behavior. In practical terms, what are some of these norms of responsible behavior that could look like in terms of developing, even if it is a short-term temporary fixes, before we come to having a legally binding mechanisms and so on and so on. And norms are nothing but what is an expected behavior from us as good citizens or responsible stakeholder, in a sense. So they are essentially what is expected, that is can be termed as appropriate behaviors. These are mostly common sense stuff. I don't think it is very complicated. For instance, that we shouldn't be throwing garbage at our neighbor's house is an acceptable behavior or a responsible behavior. Interfering in my neighbor's TV antenna and creating disruptions in their TV operations is not a good thing. It's not an appropriate behavior. It doesn't need a rocket science to tell you that this is what is responsible and what is irresponsible behavior. So we need to think about a few helpful measures that could be developed in order to minimize disruptions, help create more predictability in space activities, and those are the things that we need to pursue. But norm breaking has become a pattern in recent times, very quickly. Just very quickly to say, one, for instance, there was, and norms and rules, both are important when it comes to governance. Norms are as important as rules, for written rules, in a sense. We had a norm of not conducting ASAT tests for a very long time, for about 2 decades. that was broken down in a couple of decades ago, more than a decade ago, and that has set in motion a series of other activities. Not to interfere in each other's satellite operations, again, a norm that prevailed for a long time, but that has again come into, that has again set in motion a series of destructive activities. So how do we help generate some simple norms of responsible behavior that can eventually lead to better trust in each other, better confidence in each other, that might actually lead to an environment where we are able to agree upon a legally binding set of measures at an eventual date. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajagopalan. A good question about how these norms can be thought about and decided upon, and hopefully that's what we'll continue to discuss over the course of today. Our next speaker is going to be one of our online panelists. Dr. Steer, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I cannot agree more, Raji, that nothing replaces being in the room with other people. But I'm really grateful also for the hybrid setup that Unitia has offered for me this evening, because I can take care of family needs and then join you in Geneva. So thank you to Unitia for making the hybrid setup possible. So I was adjusting my comments as both Aidan and Raji were speaking. So I've been scribbling notes, which I will now give you as my comments, because there was a lot of overlap I was going to say. One of the threads I wanted to pick up on, I guess, is that in many ways, we really have to understand how unique space is. So it's unique as an environment. It's a very fragile environment and a very difficult environment to be able to navigate and gain accurate information about what's happening. And obviously, one of the reasons why direct ascent anti-satellite weapons tests or deployments are very clearly irresponsible is because the amount of debris it creates. It's impossible to contain where that debris goes and the clouds that it creates. It's impossible to contain the impacts of it. It's unique also because of timelines. In some senses, space is very fast because objects are moving, particularly in low Earth orbit, at 7 kilometers a second or 10 times the speed of a bullet. And so we have to deal with the impacts of activities in a very fast moving environment. At the same time, space is slow because if you want to deploy something or launch something, or even first design, build, and then launch something, the time windows can be months or years. And so there is a very different period of time over which decisions can be made to respond in the space domain itself. On the other hand, space is not at all unique, and it would be a mistake to think of space security as something separate or entirely different from other security issues, terrestrial security issues. And there's so much to learn. I love the work of Jessica West, for instance, from Project Plowshares. There's so much to learn about what else is going on in arms control discussions around the world on different kinds of capabilities, what's happening in the women, peace and security agenda. Space is actually not unique. And as Aidan pointed out, geopolitics are playing out in space as well. So space, and I would say cyber as well, are two domains which are not only multipolar, because we're in a multipolar geopolitical era in the 2020s, which makes it more complex than the 20th century space security issues. But they're also both domains which are multi-stakeholder. So the fact that not only do we have over 80 countries with space programs, and as Victoria said, almost no country on Earth that is not dependent on space systems, we also have other kinds of stakeholders, in particular the commercialization of space, which has added another layer of complexity to space security. And so I've done a little bit of work around notions of deterrence in space. Because space is unique and yet is not unique, when countries are thinking about deterrence and deterring activities that might escalate into an armed conflict, we have to understand the concept of Aidan laid out for the fact that it is both multipolar and multi-stakeholder. And we also have to understand that the best way to respond to a threat to a space system may not be in the space domain. It might be in a different domain. It might be in the cyber domain. It might be on the ground, in the air, on land, or at sea. That might be a better way to respond or indeed to deter when we think that there may be an attack or a threat to a space system. when we talk about space situational awareness, which deterrence requires understanding who's doing what, where in space, the space traffic management aspect and the space security aspect of it, what a particular capability is, where an object is at any given time, if it's moving around in unexpected ways within an orbit, if it's moving up close to, in proximity to another satellite or spacecraft. But space situational awareness, beyond that technical awareness, also needs to include awareness of strategies and policies and spending on space programs. And that kind of information is actually mostly available open source, but there should be a lot more work done, I think, around making those strategies and policies explicit and transparent, because that contributes to space situational awareness, politically speaking. And I think that's actually, in fact, it is very much highlighted as a potential TCBM, a transparency and confidence building measure. If we go back to the 2013 GGE on TCBMs, just to link a lot of acronyms together, that increased transparency and sharing about strategies and policies could contribute to reducing threats. So I guess the final comment I'll make now is that those vectors that Raji mentioned of Earth to space, space to Earth, space to space, and Earth to Earth are very useful technical vectors, and they have been extremely useful in the first meetings of the open-ended working group, where there was an ability to assist diplomats in the room to really understand the range of threats and technologies that a space system faces. But I would say what is most useful is not focusing on capabilities. And that is really my greatest hope of what's going to come out of the OEWG, is that there is a focus on norms of behavior, rules, norms, and principles. And there's a lot more to say about how to define those three terms. But if we focus on capabilities, not only are we going to get stuck in the debates of the past several decades, we're also going to be very outdated very quickly. And, you know, we end up in huge debates about, is something a fractional orbital bombardment system or not? Is a hypersonic actually a space system or space threat or not? You know, when a certain country says we are going to target commercial satellites, we shouldn't be focusing so much on whether they're going to be targeting with an anti-satellite weapon, but rather the question of whether and when commercial satellites are targetable lawfully under international humanitarian law, which they certainly can be if they fit the definition according to location, purpose, and use in the circumstances at the time, but also what means are going to be used to target that. So it's not about the capability, it's about applying principles to fact. And, you know, and again, the norm that is certainly very clearly emerging around the irresponsibility of direct ascent anti-satellite weapons is not about the capability, it's about a norm of behavior. Australia just last week joined 7 other countries who committed not to test anti-satellite weapons. And I've had a lot of discussions with people here who say, oh, we don't have the capability anyway. It was very easy to make as a commitment, to which my response is, it's a very easy commitment to make because it is a norm of behavior, because we understand that the deliberate creation of long-term debris is by definition irresponsible. And so testing something that we know will have that effect is irresponsible. So it's not about the capability. Those vectors are helpful, but we really have to focus very much on behavior. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steer. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you guys later on about commercial actors being targeted, so I'm going to hold your water on that one. We'll get more deep into this later on. Dr. Wang, please give us your thoughts on all these issues for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for the floor, and good day to all. First, I thank the very kind invitation from Unileader, and I also thank the previous three speakers, from whom I've always, learned a lot. And I'm afraid I might say something different, but of course my views is not necessarily, supposed to be adopted by my government or any other delegation, although they should think about it. So I would just briefly share my views about the definition of space threat, a correlation of space threat and deterrence, and the DA asset test initiative. So first of all, the definition of a space threat should be defined in order to better understand its interaction with space security governance and avoid unnecessary debates and insufficient discussions. I ever just proposed the concept of space threat during the OEWG second session in September. In the context of space security, space threat means a status which is based on intentional behavior, which may cause negative impacts to space assets, activities, and interests of another country, including undermining international peace and security. I think especially reflected in the views from the ambassador. And to this end, another concept has to be examined simultaneously, that is space deterrence. And it is definitely a sensitive and controversial concept, but without observing space threat from a deterrence perspective, it would be hard to deeply understand a state's position on a particular Paris initiative, no matter it agrees or disagrees in this case. So as far as I'm concerned, threat and deterrence are the two sides of the coin, which are both the tools of a state to pursue the sense of strategic security or superiority, depending on which country it is, and subsequently are tools for strategic games among states. Frankly speaking, it means that the various space threats, which are deemed as negative factors to the safety of space activities and environment, might be simultaneously taken as positive elements for national security and the necessary measures to preserve the balanced, stable space relations. I'm not quite sure, but I think we should discuss this matter seriously. Therefore, it discloses the nature of space arms race is exactly about the same and old story. That is the paradox between national and international security, between the rationale of self-interest, self-protection, and self-restraint, or altruism, say, benefiting others. Meanwhile, some states might wave the flag, we see the flag there, of environment protection to cover its real intention to mitigate or degrade the strategic deterrence it suffered. Thus, it should not be taken for granted that a Paris initiative, which is superficially conducive to protect space environment, deserves majority support without any doubt. Space sustainability, definitely, it is the ultimate goal of space governance in general, but more factors should be taken into account in the context of space security governance. I'm afraid they are different, unfortunately. Assume that the national security concerns and the relevant strategic needs were not duly considered and only space environment protection were emphasized, then the practical and efficient solution for Paris is hard to be achieved. Compared with various capabilities of generating space threats, it is the escalation of space relations, as mentioned by the ambassador, the lack of necessary mutual trusts and contingency measures in the event of space crisis, which brings more significant and fundamental risks or challenges to space environment and sustainability. Thus, a stable relation, the stable space relation is a more urgent target than a sustainable space environment in the context of space security governance. Therefore, as I argued in the joint panel of the first and fourth committees on 27th October, space stability should be taken as a primary standard to evaluate the pros and cons of an international initiative of Paris. That is, whether that initiative is conducive to pursue or preserve space stability. Subsequently, I proposed three principles suggested for space security governance, respectively, are comprehensiveness, equilibrium of interest, and self-restraint. Hopefully, we have the chance to elaborate them in the Q&A. And last point, my concern about the DA asset initiative, based on the aforementioned, maybe it is true that, as indicated in the questionnaire, mechanisms against the testing of use of kinetic assets are seen by many as low-hanging fruit. but I'm afraid it might turn out to be a poisonous apple if it were not addressed and discussed under the 3 principles I proposed. Thus, without a comprehensive discussion on space security matters, this initiative might not bring us space stability as we expected. On the contrary, it might aggravate space tensions among powers and even stimulate a new round of arms race in space. Moreover, it might lead to escalation of misunderstanding and misperceptions, which might cause accidental conflicts in space and eventually bring us a more vulnerable space environment. Until then, we might find the plausibly reasonable asset test initiative just leads us to a totally upset direction to the one it indicates. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And I appreciate you bringing up the direct-to-send ASAT test discussion. I feel like this crowd already knows this, but in case you weren't aware, yesterday in New York, draft resolution L62, destructive direct-to-send anti-satellite missile testing, was adopted with a vote of 154 in favor, 8 against, and 10 abstentions. With that, we have about a little over half an hour for Q&A. I'll remind the audience, if you have questions here in person, flip your placards up. Those of you online, feel free to submit your questions, and I, of course, will use the power of the chair to ask my questions of the panelists. Any of the panelists can answer. Just let me know if you're interested. So when we're talking about threats, really and truly, what are the realistic threats that we need to truly concern about, in terms of like rating? Which segments of space systems are most likely to be threatened? Are these easily attributed through what means, what have you? Who would like to start? Perhaps someone in person?
I think it's a great question, and I think this is something we're actively thinking about ahead of the 3rd round of the open-ended working group, because this is really something that will be front and centre there. I think I think there's probably 3 or 4 different priorities in that sense. I think, we heard a bit yesterday about the issues of communications and signals. I think that's a really important one, and it's a sort of very present issue and something we see sort of every day. I think there's probably something around proximity operations. Again, this is something that's perfectly benign in some circumstances, depending on who's doing it, under what circumstances, what capabilities each object has, what purpose each object has, and depending on what sort of communication between the operators is like. But obviously, it can have it can sort of give rise to suspicion and tension and potential escalation as well. So I think they're two sort of issues. DAASAT we've discussed already, and I think that's certainly a third. So I think there'll be others. I think probably the laser question as well might be one that we could look at, because again that's something that I think is a present issue and something that can really have demonstrable impacts. So I think they're some of the ones that I see as being the most sort of present and perhaps the priority issues to discuss. But there'll be others, and again, each country will have its own different perceptions of what they see as the most pressing issues.
The whole question of what are the kind of realistically speaking, what are the kind of threats that we need to be concerned about? And here I would think, I would take on Andre, who was yesterday making a point about not get so excessively focused on perceptual threats or imaginary threats. And I agree with that. But I think here we need to be clear about what are we fictionalizing in a sense. For instance, how often have you seen space to ground threats really playing out? Whereas to me, space to space as well as ground to space threats have been playing out pretty much, and I think those are realistic threats that we need to address them right now. Arms race is something that's going to happen. It is happening, but again, something that we don't see really playing out at this point of time. So in a sense, that's a kind of the basis of the various threats that we need to look at. I just wanted to add one other point about the whole capabilities versus behavior. It's a good. I remember this was a point of discussions even in the GG in 2018-19, and of course the OEWG is seeing a lot of that debate. It is a good thing that we have moved away from capabilities to behavior. But there is also one problem that might come from a number of smaller countries, developing countries who have just begun their space programs, which is that technologies and capabilities take a long time to develop. It takes quite a bit of time to mature in a sense. Whereas intentions, behaviors, these can change literally overnight. So what do you do about the capabilities and technologies that are being developed by the established space players? So that is still an issue of some concern to a number of different countries, even during the International Code of Conduct debates a decade ago. I think this was some of the debates, and this was some of the concerns expressed by a number of developing countries who felt that established space players are using these bigger capabilities, major capabilities, counter space capabilities, and so on and so forth, as justifying it as a deterrence means, but also this is a way of truly weaponizing those. So I'm just placing it on record to say that these are still some concerns that play out. It is a good thing that we have moved away from capabilities to behavioral approach, but I think these are still some concerns playing out in the minds of smaller number of developing countries in a sense.
Thank you, Raji. Cassandra, I think I saw your hand raised. Did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, thanks. So just to pick up on what you just said there, Raji, it's so important to understand the different interests and inequalities of different states in these debates with respect to how developed they are as space programs or space military capabilities. But I would say again, that is kind of, for me, I'm in this, I'm going to propose myself both as a realist and an optimist, if it's possible, that the realist in me says, but we cannot stop the greater powers doing what they're going to do. And there is quite a competition in space, because space is another domain in which geopolitics is being played out, a competition between the greater and rising powers, and all of which, or most of which, have had space programs for quite some years. We can't realistically constrain exactly what they are developing technologically, particularly as counter space technologies become more and more complex and covert and difficult to identify. That's the realist in me. The optimist in me says this is why focusing on norms, rules, and principles is so important and so useful, because what we can do is say, well, then countries that are still developing their space programs can continue to try out and learn from technologies and develop them, and hopefully space middle powers like Australia will do a greater job at space capacity building and supporting those smaller nations, as long as those technologies are being used according to principles of responsible behavior. And as long as those greater powers are using whatever technologies they have or are developing according to those same principles, I think that is our best bet for space security moving forward. I really do. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think it's very clear that space weapons are not the greatest threat, that it's very useful to keep remembering that a space system is made up not only of a space asset, but also the ground segment, which receives whatever communications or data that is necessary and which operates the space asset, and the link between them through which those communications are sent. Plus the fourth segment would be, of course, humans, the operators and the users and those dependent on those space systems. So the greatest threats are to the ground, the link. But that may change in the next 10, 15 or 20 years as technologies change and develop, as we move from near Earth orbit to be very much more in the cis-lunar space, so between Earth and the moon, and very much it's the lunar competition that we're going to see emerge. It might be that space-based capabilities become a greater threat, which again is a reason for me to focus on those norms rather than on the capabilities. And the other thing that I think really is a great threat to space security is lack of transparency and lack of space literacy across a lot of governments. So the TCBMs, which I mentioned before, which focus on sharing information about strategies and policies, really focusing on rhetoric. What kept space stable in the 1980s and 90s was a shared value, actually particularly during the Cold War and then in the years beyond, between the superpowers, that strategic restraint was necessary. So restraining behaviours to ensure that space remained accessible and usable for all of its national and international security applications. And then we saw a move away from that in the early 2000s and 2010s, a very concerning move away from that, which was escalatory. And I think we're just seeing a return to more of an understanding that we all need to have some sense of restraint if we all want to keep using space intergenerationally, not only for national security today, but into the future. So it's another area, where I think we need to think beyond technology and into what's happening around the policies and strategies and politically.
Thank you, Cassandra. Guoyu, did you want to weigh in on which systems most likely to be threatened or the most realistic types of counterspace capabilities we're likely to see? Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Just before that, we talk a lot about the categories. I might reserve the comments on this later on. But before that, as you asked, so from the technical perspective, of course, as argued by our panelists, that like cyber attack, electromagnetic interference is hard to track, to be tracked, about the sources. But here, I'm not quite sure whether it's the right time to say so. From legal perspective, it just brings another challenge about attribution, because that the space law and the law of state's responsibility just provides different standard, or we say threshold, to define attribution. It means that to under what kind of conditions that space behavior conducted by non-governmental entities should be attributable to a state. So a higher standard actually stipulated in the general international law, say the state's responsibility law, no matter it's overall control or effective control. It always means that a genuine link or very tight connection is supposed to exist between that company or that behavior and the state. However, under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6 is a lower threshold. Maybe nationality, nexus, or license links could be deemed as, we can argue that this space activity should be deemed as that state's national space activity. It means that that state shall bear international responsibility for it. So again, these arguments just disclose, the necessity and the significance to seriously and deeply discuss legal matters in different circumstances. I just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoyu. And then one more question for the panel, and then we'll open up to the audience questions. But this builds on something Cassandra brought up that I think is a pretty hot topic these days. Commercial actors, commercial satellite operators, whose information or communications are being used by combatants in an armed conflict. Are these considered a lawful target? Yes, no, it depends. I'm guessing that our lawyers will want to jump in on this first and then maybe go to the panelists itself. Cassandra, you talked about this first, so do you want to build up a little bit on what you were saying earlier?
Thank you. Commercial satellites can absolutely become lawful targets if they fit the definition of a military objective. So international law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, IHL, says that civilian objects and civilians are protected and can never be targeted. If you do target them, that's a war crime. We see that happen. Those are war crimes. A military objective is targetable. And a military objective, if we look at Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which was drafted in 1977 to kind of update the Geneva Conventions a little bit, and is considered customary international law. So this applies to every country, whether or not they have signed on to those additional protocols, and to every party to a conflict, whether it's a state or an organized armed group, whatever. And it says that a military objective is something that, according to its nature, location, purpose, and use, is going to offer a military advantage in the circumstances ruling at the time. So you have to go through multiple layers of determining whether a bridge is sometimes civilian. It may sometimes become a targetable military objective in the circumstances at the time if it's suddenly used in a different way. A commercial satellite, may be a civilian and protected object, unless in the circumstances ruling at the time, it is, or where it is, what orbit it's in, or what service it's providing, or to whom, it might suddenly become a lawful target. That is simply a principle of international humanitarian law. But then you also have to apply the principle of proportionality, which says that even if something is a lawful target, you have to look at the means you are going to use to target that object and look at the impacts of it. And Raji talked about collateral damage, or the impact for civilians, for instance, or on the space environment. If the impact of that use, that particular attack on that lawfully targetable object, is going to have a different effect, or if you can't discriminate the effects and can't say, you know, it's only the military advantage balances with, and it's only going to impact other military objectives, then you cannot use those means. And if there's any doubt after all of those complex decisions, then international humanitarian law also says in cases of doubt, you must assume it is a civilian object. So it could be targetable. There's nothing very controversial about stating that outright. It's possibly controversial if a country says explicitly, we are going to target commercial satellites. But every military commander in every single factual situation has to apply these legal principles, whether that's in space or any other domain. And so I think it is perhaps, you know, it's become a hot topic, but I think we have some very useful existing legal principles, binding legal principles and rules, which can be very helpful to clarify. And it's up to the commanding officers to make that decision and analysis.
Thank you, Cassandra. Guoyu, did you want to add on to that?
Sure, just briefly. So first, I have to say, in general, the militarization, or we say the engagement of commercial space actors, you know, into the military action, is not expected, no matter it's stoppable or not. It might just, you know, aggravate the tensions there, and would cause more, you know, misperceptions, or maybe just some accidental armed conflicts in space. So that's the first point. And second point, I agree. I think Cassandra just mentioned that there's several legal bases regarding this case, but I have to say, as a second point, the applicability of HL or armed conflict law still should be cautiously examined. So I share this view for, you know, in some places before. But the last point, I would like to say in general, in this case, whether the commercial space object could be served as a lawful, you know, attack target or something like that. It should be examined case by case. As Cassandra just mentioned, that it's depending on its real contribution to one state, and for another state, it is supposed to prove the military benefits through no matter, you know, interfere or attack, destroy such kind of you know, assets, and also whether the target is the satellite per se, or is on-ground infrastructure, or the up-down links, is still to be considered. It might relevant to. I'm not talking about the applicability of HL, but in general, just in general international law, some precautionary measures might be considered, and it's also a matter of burden of proof. So it's also very complicated. Legal issues should be examined in a very specific cases. Then we can maybe share the agrees or disagrees. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoyu. Before I jump to the people in person, I saw Cassandra, you raised your hand again. Do you have a hot follow-up to what Guoyu was saying?
I do, and I'm so sorry, because we could, this topic we could spend a whole hour on. It's tricky, but I just wanted to also highlight that it is very difficult in space to disentangle the commercial and military dual use applications. They have become thoroughly entangled with the commercialization of space. There's been some suggestion by some academics that perhaps there's an obligation on militaries to disentangle and to create military assets or systems that can replicate what they're now depending on commercial providers for. And I think that's impossible. Not only would that double our space traffic, which causes another bunch of issues, but it's simply not feasible when commercial providers can provide it faster, cheaper, sometimes better. So the entanglement is what's making this so complex. And that is a fact that we simply have to deal with. And then there's a whole other debate about the applicability of IHL to space. I've written a fair amount on this because I think as a matter of law, it's simply not up for debate. The Outer Space Treaty says in Article 3 that all activities in outer space must take place in accordance with international law, including the UN Charter. That was a deliberate underscoring of rules around use of force applying and self-defense. And as soon as we are talking about force and conflict, if we were to enter an armed conflict in space, there's no question it would apply. And because space is already implicated in terrestrial warfare, there's no question that it applies. I know there is some debate in the OWG by certain countries, but for me as a lawyer, there simply is no debate. We can talk about what forums in which we should be discussing it, but the applicability is unquestionable. Guoyu, you may disagree, and I would love to continue this discussion with you offline to discuss.
Thank you. I'm sure we could go on for this for a while, but Raji's been very patiently waiting to contribute to this. Raji, what would you like to add to this?
Because increasingly, I think you also have private sector launching military payload for countries in a sense. So what happens when that's payload is targeted in a sense? Should the private industry hold on to the regulations and restrictions that come with the state's responsibility that might be applicable to a particular state, or will they take recourse to counterattacks and that the state may not be able to entirely restrain in a sense? So how might that play out? But there could also be scenarios you could look at, for instance, that maybe the responses are going to come from some other domain, for instance, maybe a cyber attack on a power grid or a financial network and so on and so forth. So this, in a sense, I think has the potential, especially when private sector is involved, you have this has the potential to expand into other sectors, not necessarily connected to space, but I think because the response is to target a country where it's going to hurt in a sense. So I think targeting on a private sector can go in very different ways. You may not see a direct counter space attack on a space system, but you are going to have possibly a cyber attack on one of your vital infrastructure, critical infrastructure. I think that's the more likelihood given the state of interstate relations today.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very briefly, and you know, others have opined on this far more expertly than I can, but I would also just point out that it works the other way around. Military-derived space systems also provide civilian services. GPS, for example, you know, is a military system, but lots of you know, civilian first responders rely on it to react in emergencies. So you know, this entanglement is a big question, but it works both ways.
It is definitely a symbiotic relationship. Yeah. All right, moving on to questions from the audience. We have one online from Mark Meyer, where basically he's asking, how can we foster the benign functions of dual-purpose objects while mitigating the dangers they may pose by potentially repurposing into counter space capabilities? Who would like to take that question? All right. Stump the crowd. This is interesting. Maybe that's something to think about for the thing. Raji, do you want to start off?
I think we can try and come up with a number of different ways to tackle these kind of threats. You can look at technical means to deal with some of these threats, challenges. You can look at legal solutions. But I think, to me, at the end of the day, I think the political process is the most important. Unless you have the political will to deal with some of these problems, none of it, you can make the best of laws, you can come up with the best of technical measures, but if you don't have the political will and the political issues are not really addressed, you're not going to go very far. You are not going to see compliance of measures, even if you manage somehow the other some agreement that's still going to leave out a lot of the critical players and kind of thing. So I think, therefore, my sense is that we need to focus on political issues, and that can be done only by some baby steps. So a couple of things is to look at, for instance, some of the TCBMs, practical ways of instilling confidence in each other, certain amount of openness and transparency, so that it builds in certain amount of confidence as to what the other space player is doing, what are the kind of activities that the state is engaged in. So that might instill some confidence. It might take a bit of time, but I think that's the way to go about, because otherwise all the activities are shrouded in certain amount of secrecy, and that's only going to create more insecurities, and which only will lead to creation of more and more offensive capabilities and kind of thing. That is not going to be really helpful. The other aspect is to look at maybe smaller technical agreements, maybe something that is, for instance, the global moratorium on ASAT testing, that's a good first step, targeting particularly the kinetic ASAT capabilities. But also similarly, you can look at specific area-wise agreements and so on and so forth, technical agreements that can actually provide some modicum of solution in a sense, because I think looking for an overarching, comprehensive, all-encompassing agreement is not going to happen, especially in the current international political environment. So I think this is, you got to look at political issues, targeting political issues, addressing political issues through TCBMs as a first step before you can get to build around the confidence to sign on to legal measures and so on and so forth.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that's very wise. All I would say is this comes back to the third layer of issues I was talking about in my opening remarks. Essentially, with all of these capabilities, if you're clear and transparent about your intent for those capabilities, and your actions in practice bear that out, then that's got to be the way of looking at it. And hopefully a set of agreed norms to act as a guide for that conversation would be even better.
Thank you. I see we have some questions, placards raised. Natalia Arsenault, can you identify yourselves with those who don't know you and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Natalia Arsenault and I work for the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for putting together this extremely interesting conference. As usual, it's an annual meeting for all interested in space security. I would like to first, I have one comment, one question, and first comment is coming back to the presentation of Dr. Steer. I would like to thank her for her comment on Australia joining the ASAT commitment, and I would like to announce that Switzerland has also committed last week also at the GA, the first committee, joined the commitment not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests. So I would really like to join her comment on the positive signal that such commitments do give, especially with respect to preserving the outer space environment, not creating debris in an intentional manner. And also overall as a proof of commitment for responsible behavior to maintain security in outer space. A second point is my question. And I'd like to, in view of the ongoing projects on active debris removal, on orbit servicing, rendezvous and proximity operations, and I'd like to refer to example given by Ambassador Liddle on UK developing a harpoon. Well, Switzerland is also working on a mission for active debris removal through the company ClearSpace, who is working with ESA and other international partners. So I'd like to ask for views on how states could be proactive in showing transparency, declaring intentions, possibly notifications. When we go now into the practice of what we are addressing and discussing in the OEWG on norms, principles, rules of responsible behaviors, what could be suggested as concrete measures, right? So as an example, we, from the Swiss side, we invited the CEO of the company ClearSpace to give a presentation in the name of the Swiss delegation to COPWAS this year. So to really explain about the missions and declare about the intentions, confirming there were peaceful purposes, etc. So, but I would like to go maybe more into detail on the basis of this concrete example. What could be concretely done by states, and what could be, agreed as a common practice of responsible behavior, of transparency on this example of RPOs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. Who would like to answer that question?
Yeah, again, I think, thanks, Natalia. I think, again, the question comes down to how do you demonstrate your intentions? How do you demonstrate your goals? What are you planning to do with the kind of, because anything that goes up in space can be used in a nefarious fashion. So, and especially now that you have the on-orbit satellites and satellite servicing technologies or ADR technologies, active debris removal technologies, all of that coming into play, I think, and we haven't even started having conversations about how do we regulate these kind of technologies and these activities. So we are, and the current climate, international climate would suggest that we are not going to get around to some rules of the road for those technologies in the immediate time frame. So, but at the same time, in the meantime, how do we strengthen the notion that these are technologies that are going to be used for peaceful purposes, civilian purposes? And I think we need to look at some of the other measures. And I think what you, for instance, the ClearSpace CEO going into Corpus and talking about the technology, the intentions, I think that's a good step. That's a good transparency move that you have shown there. But I think similar things that we need to look at. And so, some of the similar kind of measures that have helped in the past are, for instance, space traffic management measures, for instance. In that context, the HCOC, the Hague Code of Conduct Against Ballistic Missile Proliferation, has some important principles like pre-launch notifications measures for ballistic missile and space launches. So there are a whole lot of measures that have existed in the past that have instilled a certain amount of confidence. So can we look at some of those kind of measures to talk about these new technologies and how they are going to be used and so on and so forth. Similarly, the UNIDER early paper, ASAT test guidelines, for instance, no debris, low debris notification. Again, we need to look at if there have been other kind of demonstrative attempts at kind of that would strengthen the confidence in each other in terms of the new capabilities, new technologies that are being developed. Transparency and confidence building measures, I think that those are important and in this particular context, and there is no other way to strengthen that confidence process, political process in a sense.
Thank you. Guoyu, I think you had your hand raised.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm very happy to take this question from Natalia, and very happy to see her virtually. So first, I think it's also a combination of safety and security matters, but whether it should be discussed in Geneva or under the OEWG is another matter. But just back to how to regulate such kind of like ADR, RPO, OS matters. What would be the concrete measures? I have several suggestions. The first one, just to clarify the like mitigation measures or some precaution measures in their apply, or supposing it's a cooperative agreement, just in the make it clear in the agreement. And the second level is about the notification matters, TCBM, when and where would they take such kind of action, and maybe send the necessary message for others who are around that area to take avoidance of clearing in advance. And then another element is about the allocation of the risks or liability. I think it should be also addressed in the SAT agreement. And the last point, again, take this opportunity to say such kind of dual use matters. Personally, I'm not convinced that the dual use capability or technology is the key element for seeking for, like a solution about space security governance. And we talked a lot. It's not a matter about capability, technology, it's a matter about behavior. But again, yes and no, actually it's about intention. We have so many categories, space, ground, space, blah, blah. But actually, the biggest threat we should consider is the state-to-state threat. So the main target for us is to consider how to mitigate, even eliminate the misunderstandings, that or the tensions among the powers, how to achieve their strategic understandings, and how to establish some like contingency measures, some necessary mechanism like space crisis management and control. And through this way, I think the intention could be clarified through such kind of a dialogue or coordination mechanism. Intention, Ambassador mentioned that they can show their intention at the very first place, but unfortunately for the military context, laser dazzling, jamming, spoofing, the actors are not supposed and obliged to share such kind of intention before taking action. So that's not the key point. The point again is still how to keep these dirty, maybe dark art, the dark things in the orderly, framework. So that's, I think, the most urgent thing for us to handle with. I just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoyu. Okay, we have 5 minutes and 2 placards raised, so I'm going to ask for in the back very quickly, 30 seconds to ask your question, and 30 seconds, and then keeping in mind we're waiting on lunch, the panelists give you responses. 30 seconds, go.
I'll have mine of the One Goal Initiative. Simple question: which threats do you see in quantum, and what should be done to mitigate?
Threats in quantum, and the next question.
Hi, so thinking of the private sector, what are your thoughts on about class action against particular states who would unwillingly, I guess, basically shoot down or attack, I would say, civilian-focused commercial entities in space, or be it not on space, but on Earth? Because I think there is the avenue of arbitration.
Okay, well, I'm sorry,
but I'd like to hear
we're short on
thoughts.
time,
Thanks.
so thank you. All right, so quantum, class action on commercial attacks, and then also I would like each panelist to give their final remarks. So 1 minute, thoughts on any of these items? We'll start here.
So neither of those questions is I don't feel qualified to tackle either of those questions, and I'm sure the panelists will give you far more expert comments than I can. So I will leave them to others. But I agree actually with a lot of what Dr. Wang just said in his last answer about what it is we're trying to do here. We're not sort of necessarily trying to I think that framing about sort of trying to bring some order to some of the perhaps murkier stuff that goes on is a really good way of thinking about it. There is a lot that is prohibited already, and Cassandra's given a very good overview of exactly how sort of law the legal process applies at the moment. But there is a lot which probably is legally allowable, which is probably not desirable, either from an environmental point of view or from a security point of view or a stability point of view. And this is the area we're working in, and this is the difficult stuff, which is why it's taken so long to tackle it. But that's what we're doing now.
Thank you, Ambassador. Cassandra, can you give us your last thoughts?
Quantum, I think, is fascinating, particularly what it's going to be as part of future satellite communications. But I think we're not there yet, and we're going to need to understand it differently once that's online in the next 20 years. We're just not there yet, and then we can respond to those. And class actions are a great way in a private law capacity to deal with private law interests, but I don't think it's the biggest contribution to space security. I guess as a final thought, it's very clear in all of our discussions that there are no easy answers. And Jess West yesterday said, norms are hard. This is not something we can snap our fingers and respond to. But I remain very optimistic about the OEWG process. The same issues get politicized no matter what forum we are speaking in, but I really remain optimistic that we're going to get to, maybe 5, maybe 10, but still quite useful consensus-based norms of behavior. And I hope that will help us progress the discussion and activities and actual behaviors further as well.
Thank you, Cassandra. Guoyu, last thoughts?
Thank you, Victoria. So I have to say that I'm not convinced by the responsible, irresponsible approach, unfortunately. Sorry that, Ambassador. But
we're turning off your mic.
Yeah, partially response to the question. Excuse me. Like commercial attack, I would not like to use the term attack. We suggest some countermeasures, technical measures against such kind of assets. Under international law, it's still unsettled issue whether it is legal or not. It could be deemed as use of force or under attack. Of course, it's illegal. It could also be argued as a countermeasure under responsibility, state's responsibility law, or the distress or necessity, then such kind of behavior could be justified, and its wrongfulness could be excluded. So that's why I said behavior, yes and no. Behavior also is really hard to say kind of behavior is irresponsible or responsible, because it's really hard to say so without the specific scenario. So that's my last argument there. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoyu. And Raji, bring us home.
Yeah, I think Guoyu gave me the final meat in a sense. It's not exactly very difficult to see what is responsible and what is not acceptable behavior. Again, not rocket science, but you can see that you don't need to create more garbage in space that is going to result, that's going to stay there for a very long time and make space unusable. The use of space, somehow we take it for granted, but the uninterrupted use of space is not a given, it's not a guaranteed thing. So unless we take serious measures to regulate our activities, to bring about certain restraint in the kind of activities we need to engage in space. Space is not going to be usable in a very long time. And space, everybody has a notion that it is it's an infinite thing, but I think the usable orbits in space are finite in nature, and therefore we need to think about space safety, security, and sustainability if we have to be able to use. The OEWG process is a really good one, because I think we also need to be mindful of the process as much as the kind of any final agreement that we come to, in a sense. The process is as important, because you've gone through an ICOC process that did not take us very far. So in a sense, I think the OEWG presents us with a good opportunity, in a sense, because it is open-ended. It does include everybody, including from civil society. So there is an opportunity for everybody to contribute to that debate, contribute to that conversation, and how we want to secure and ensure sustainable use of space, in a sense. It does give, therefore, everyone a sense of inclusivity, a sense of possessiveness, in a sense, that could lead to better implementation of rules, whatever we come to at the end of the 4 sessions of the OEWG. So there's still some hope, and I hope we do have a positive outcome from the OEWG in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. Always nice to end on a positive note. Please join me in thanking this panel for an excellent discussion of a difficult topic.